As the world breathed a sigh of relief after World War II, a new dilemma emerged: what to do with the vast surplus of military equipment left behind. Aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons that had once been vital to the war effort now stood idle, obsolete, and expensive to maintain. Nations, exhausted from years of conflict, had to find a way to deal with this material excess. The once powerful tools of destruction became burdens. Some sold off, some discarded, others left to rust away. The fate of these war machines, now symbols of a world that had changed, would define the post-war era in unexpected and often unsettling ways. In the summer of 1945, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The weapons that had scarred continents for 6 long years, tanks, planes, ships, and bombs, were now, for the most part, no longer in the hands of those who had waged war. But their future was far from certain. The tools of devastation were no longer needed for the brutal pursuit of power. So what happened to them? At the war's end, the immediate concern was not just the rebuilding of cities, the healing of economies, or the re-establishment of societies. It was the sheer scale of material surplus left in the wake of destruction. Entire fleets of ships, thousands of aircraft, and stockpiles of military vehicles sat idle, and they were not easily disposed of. The economic pressures that followed the war were profound. Nations that had poured immense resources into producing weapons for battle now had to face the reality of peace. The costs of continuing to maintain this vast military machinery, at a time when recovery and economic reconstruction were paramount, were unsustainable. For most nations, war production had been the central focus for years. Factories that once roared with the sounds of assembly lines now stood silent. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had once been soldiers of war were either demobilized or reassigned, their futures uncertain. The war machine, once so vital, had become a burden. To maintain these weapons would have been far too expensive, and most countries were already struggling under the weight of the devastation wrought by the war. There was also the pressing question of what to do with the military resources that were now obsolete. The conflict that had justified their existence had ended, and the world was changing too rapidly for their continued utility. From the perspective of the United States, the issue of surplus war materials was immense. The U.S. had been a major producer during the war, and with victory, their stockpiles were enormous. At the end of the conflict, the U.S. military had amassed 25 million tons of war materials, ranging from tanks and airplanes to trucks and jeeps, some of which were no longer needed in the post-war world. The American government faced the dilemma of dealing with this enormous surplus. While some equipment was sent to allied nations in the form of aid or for rebuilding their own forces, much of it was simply discarded, melted down, or sold off at a fraction of the cost. There was no need for the vast number of vehicles, planes, and ships that had once been critical to the war effort. The material might have been priceless during wartime, but in peace, it was more of a liability than an asset. In Europe, the situation was just as dire. The war had left behind a continent in ruins, with cities flattened, economies in tatters, and populations displaced. Countries like Britain and France, which had relied heavily on American and Soviet wartime supplies, found themselves unable to maintain large standing armies or the weapons that had sustained them through the war. Britain, with its debt skyrocketing in the post-war period, had no option but to scrap or sell off much of the equipment that had been so critical just months before. The British government quickly realized that maintaining a bloated military infrastructure in a world that demanded economic recovery would bankrupt the nation. For the Soviet Union, the situation was equally complicated. The USSR had also produced vast quantities of military equipment, much of which was no longer needed. As the Soviets moved toward their own post-war reconstruction efforts, many of their tanks, aircraft, and artillery were abandoned in warehouses or left to rust in fields. Some of the surplus was sold to other nations, especially to newly formed communist states. But much of it, as was often the case with Soviet materials, was simply allowed to deteriorate. This was particularly true for the Soviet Union's mass-produced tanks and vehicles, many of which, despite their initial battlefield success, had become obsolete in the changing strategic landscape. But the largest question was what to do with the ships. The end of the war had left the U.S. Navy with a staggering number of vessels, most of them brand new, sitting idle at docks or in mothball fleets. These ships, once integral to naval dominance during the war, now seemed redundant in the face of the shifting global landscape. Some were scrapped, and some were converted for civilian use, but the majority were simply sold off at incredibly low prices or abandoned. The war had been the catalyst for an unprecedented naval buildup, and now, in peacetime, it left the United States with an excess of warships, many of which would never be used again. In some ways, the overwhelming scale of the surplus led to a degree of environmental neglect. This was especially true in the case of tanks and other armored vehicles, which were often left to rust in vast scrapyards or abandoned military zones. These once fearsome machines of war became little more than discarded metal. Entire tank cemeteries dotted the landscape in places like northern France, where hundreds of thousands of tanks were stored in open fields or left to disintegrate into the earth. In some cases, these rusting hulks were repurposed for use in civilian industry. Scrap metal could always be turned into something more useful, but much of it simply faded into history. In the U.S., one of the more bizarre consequences of this surplus was the auctioning off of military vehicles. Surplus sales were common, and many civilians were able to purchase tanks, jeeps, and trucks from military depots at a fraction of their original cost. Some were converted into farming vehicles, others were sold off to collectors, while some found their way into Hollywood movies, forever immortalized as symbols of wartime power. It was a strange and unsettling irony. Machines designed to kill and destroy were now being auctioned off, the symbol of a world that no longer needed them but had yet to truly let go of them. In Japan, the story was different, but no less complicated. The Japanese Imperial Army had long relied on tanks, aircraft, and ships. With the end of the war and the occupation of Japan by Allied forces, much of the country's military infrastructure was dismantled. Factories were repurposed, and equipment was scrapped. However, many of the tanks and airplanes that had once been a symbol of Japan's wartime might were now abandoned or destroyed. Some, however, were retained by the newly formed Japanese self-defense forces, though many of these materials were outdated or inefficient. The decision to recycle or scrap wartime materials was made on a case-by-case basis, determined by the nation's financial ability to store and maintain these war machines. Countries with fewer resources simply allowed their equipment to degrade, while those with more wealth or political influence often found ways to repurpose or redistribute the materials in some form. But, in a broader sense, the vast amount of military surplus that filled the post-war world signified a loss. It marked the death of an era, a time when the world had been consumed by violence and the machinery of war had been essential to survival. The post-war world did not simply discard these materials because they were obsolete. In many ways, the decision to scrap or abandon them reflected the growing weariness of a world tired of conflict, a world that sought peace but found it complicated and elusive. For some, the very act of scrapping or abandoning these materials was a symbol of the end of the war, of moving away from the dark days of destruction and violence. But for others, these discarded war machines were a haunting reminder of what had been lost in the fight for peace. The future of the recycled war materials from World War II was still unfolding as the global community entered the early years of the Cold War, a time of intense uncertainty. Their fate was not a simple one. It was still evolving as the machines themselves continued to rust, fade, and vanish into history. With the immediate post-war years behind them, the aftermath of World War II surplus war materials became an even more pressing issue for nations across the globe. While many countries had dealt with the first wave of excess military equipment through the mass scrapping, sale, or repurposing of planes, tanks, and ships, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the full scope of what had happened to these once mighty assets started to reveal itself. The impact was far-reaching, and its consequences would resonate for decades. Not only did it shape how the world dealt with its military legacy, but it also reflected the shifting economic, political, and environmental realities of the post-war world. In the United States, the situation had initially been dealt with pragmatically. While many aircraft, ships, and vehicles had been sold, scrapped, or abandoned, some were repurposed for civilian use. The U.S. government quickly realized that many of the war materials could be used to bolster peacetime industries. The vast network of war factories that had been constructed during the war was converted for the production of consumer goods, and some wartime technologies were adapted for civilian purposes. For example, surplus military trucks were converted into civilian delivery vehicles, and military aircraft were modified for commercial use. It was a moment of economic transformation, as the infrastructure that had been built for war suddenly shifted gears to meet the demands of a peacetime economy. But despite these efforts, much of the war material was still too advanced or too specific to the needs of the civilian market to be fully repurposed. Some vehicles, especially tanks and armored cars, found new lives in completely unexpected ways. They became popular for use in film productions, especially in Hollywood. Tanks and jeeps, once instruments of death and destruction, were now being used to shoot fictional battles for the screen. A strange irony took hold. The same equipment that had been used to fight and kill was now being used to tell stories of those very same battles. The war material of the past was increasingly consumed by the media machine, redefined as symbols of a time that had already passed. While this reuse served to bolster the entertainment industry, it also prevented many of these machines from being fully disposed of, preserving their existence in ways that few had anticipated. In the meantime, the U.S. military faced its own internal dilemmas about the future of its massive stockpiles. The decision to mothball vast fleets of ships, many of which were still in near-new condition, became a matter of political contention. Some argued that the ships, particularly aircraft carriers, were essential for maintaining a global military presence in the emerging Cold War environment. But the reality of post-war economics quickly set in. The costs of maintaining a fleet of warships, especially given the rapid advancements in military technology, were too high to justify. This led to the creation of the mothball fleet, a storage system designed to preserve the ships in reserve with the hope that they could be reactivated if necessary. In practice, however, many of these ships would remain in storage for decades, and many were eventually scrapped or sold for scrap metal as the Cold War's demands shifted toward new technologies. But the issues surrounding surplus war materials were not confined to the United States alone. In Europe, the situation was more dire. Countries like Britain, which had been devastated by bombings during the war and whose economy was in shambles, found it difficult to justify keeping large stockpiles of obsolete military hardware. British aircraft carriers, once symbols of the country's naval prowess, were slowly scrapped or sold to other nations. The British government had no choice but to sell off many of the materials in order to finance the country's recovery, often at a fraction of their true value. In some cases, these materials were sent to countries that were rebuilding or establishing their own military forces, many of which were newly aligned with the West during the Cold War. The UK became a primary exporter of surplus military materials, and countries in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa found themselves inheriting a strange assortment of weaponry and vehicles. These nations, many newly independent or recovering from war, were thrust into a military arms race that they were ill-prepared to handle. For the Soviet Union, the question of what to do with surplus military equipment was complicated by both practical and ideological concerns. The USSR had been one of the war's most prolific producers of military vehicles and weapons, and at the end of the conflict, it found itself with vast stockpiles of surplus material. Like the Western powers, the Soviets were not in a position to maintain these vast quantities of war machines. The equipment was old, outdated by new technological standards, and increasingly irrelevant to the needs of a country recovering from years of brutal warfare. But the Soviet approach to dealing with surplus material was different. While the US and Britain turned to sales and repurposing, the Soviet government often chose to allow much of the surplus to deteriorate or be scrapped. Some of the surplus military hardware was transferred to Allied communist states, while other equipment was sold or even simply abandoned in warehouses. Tanks, planes, and artillery that had once been central to the Soviet war effort were now collecting dust, some quietly forgotten in the remote outskirts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. As the Cold War deepened, these materials would begin to play a role in an entirely new geopolitical context. The competition for influence between the U.S. and the USSR meant that some of the surplus equipment found new purposes as symbols of ideological power. These machines were not just obsolete war material, they were political tools, symbols of the ideological battles that were playing out on the global stage. Surplus tanks and fighter jets became pawns in a larger game of influence, sometimes finding themselves on the front lines of proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East. For many countries, receiving these surplus goods from one superpower or another was a mark of prestige, one that would often bind them to the political goals of the donor nation. In this way, the recycled war materials, once symbols of destruction, were now being wielded as tools of power in a different form. At the same time, the environmental consequences of this vast surplus began to emerge. In the early post-war years, the urgency to dispose of these materials often overpowered concerns about their long-term environmental impact. Tanks, jeeps, and aircraft were abandoned in massive scrapyards, where they were stripped of any usable parts and sent to the smelters. But the sheer volume of discarded military equipment meant that large amounts of toxic materials, such as fuels, oils, and asbestos, were left behind to contaminate the land. In many cases, these materials were simply left to rust, disintegrating over time but continuing to pollute the surrounding areas. Environmental concerns were rarely a priority in the immediate post-war period, as countries scrambled to rebuild their economies and deal with the sheer scale of the destruction that had occurred.